I mean, the point on which you finished, Mark, what with the kind of challenges to our thinking that James outlined about how we think about fragility, the need to focus on building resilience. I mean, where does this leave the scope for international engagement, do you think? I mean, do we need to radically rethink what we've thought up till now about the scope and potentially the limits of international engagement in fragile situations?
Thanks, Alison. I'll try and answer that question through a range of responses, both to what James has said and also some of the things that Sarah raised just now, and then link it at the end to some of the themes coming out of our forthcoming white paper, which puts a lot of emphasis on this particular area. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And, of course, we welcome and build on the ideas coming out of research and research programs such as the one that James leads. And I'd like to see it as a rather healthy and iterative process in which the fruits of research help to shape some of the boundaries of policy. And likewise, some of the priorities of policy create new opportunities for fresh, challenging and independent research. So in that spirit, James, I agree with every single conclusion on your last slide. And it's very much the direction that our work is presently taking in policy terms, as you know, in terms of putting inclusive political settlements at the heart of some of our new policy framework on state building and peace building. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So I don't want to just be seen to be agreeing with my colleagues on the table. I will actually raise some questions in the course of their presentations that might help our discussion. Both of you said we need a better concept. We need a better way of understanding these states and their context. But neither of you yet has come up with that alternative. Nor do we in the policy community have a better alternative. And it's an endless source of frustration that we use this shorthand of fragile and conflict-affected states to talk about some 40 or 50 very different countries and very different contexts. It's a lazy shorthand in many ways. On the other hand, it also helps to demarcate the way that we function potentially quite differently in these contexts from what you might call, perhaps use James's term, of resilient countries. Not all of them stagnant, some of them exhibiting really quite high rates of growth despite the downturn. So I would question about the concept of stagnation. But resilience with limited deep societal change, perhaps. In other words, we're thinking about the broader range of ways we operate in environments that are not necessarily defined by resilient, stable, democratic environments in which budget support is our preferred instrument. Again, I'll come back to it. So if fragility is not the right term and analytically lazy, what's a better one? Secondly, to James's list, which I heartily endorse, of basic functions of a state, as we think through our approach to state building, I would add one more, and that's the rule of law. Because without the rule of law, you're not going to have a framework in which you can achieve basic rights for all. And the rule of law underpins effective security provision. I'm saying that because we certainly would support the centrality of security and revenue raising, perhaps with one different inflection. Security for us doesn't mean a stronger military and a stronger police alone. It certainly means a more accountable military and a more accountable police. But actually it means a whole range of ways in which we privilege the security of the poor and the most socially excluded and vulnerable. And in thinking of security as a basic right, not just as something that is done to others by rather hegemonic, dominant state machineries. And perhaps where I differ most from James is about saying that whilst I fully support the conclusions in terms of privileging the reconstruction of state capability, I would differ in two fundamental respects. I don't think we can afford to ignore the developmental functions of a state in thinking this through. I heard you quite strongly, in a sense, suggesting a sequence which is certainly important, but privileging security, the rule of law and revenue raising, in themselves actually are developmental actions. First of all, building tax is a developmental function. It creates the revenue basis of the state and it improves the legitimacy of those in charge of state power, potentially, if done well and if done accountably. But beyond that, at the end of the day, the reason to try and create, support resilient, capable states is to enable them to develop, to deliver development more effectively. So I would argue it's right that we shouldn't necessarily privilege at the outset primarily a state capacity to deliver health and education and other basic service through the state. We must think about ways of ensuring that critical humanitarian needs are addressed, many of which will not necessarily be through the state. I very much take Sarah's point about looking for the right interface between an early humanitarian response, working increasingly to build the capability of the state to take on that responsibility over the longer term. But there will necessarily be a long period, particularly in the most fragile post-Civil War states, to use perhaps a more appropriate term, when the state will not have that capability to deliver services effectively. It may be, and we have to think about this very hard, that there are other mechanisms through which fast, scaled-up support for rapid service delivery in the post-humanitarian response phase needs to be achieved outside but not ignoring the state. So there's two sets of reasons why this cannot be thought about outside the longer-term developmental functions of a state. The other line of disagreement really is about the character of a state, its democratic character. We use the term increasingly of responsive and inclusive state building. Responsive because the ever-present danger, you can strengthen capacity in the different dimensions that we've highlighted, but the risk of autocracy will be there. We need to guard against the lapse into strong and yet fundamentally unaccountable and hence conflict-prone states. So accountability and responsiveness do matter to safeguard against states developing unaccountable and potentially problematic structures. Let me just pick up a few points about political settlements. This is where I fundamentally agree with James. This is really, really important and increasingly shaping some of our own thinking around how we understand state building and peace building. We're shortly going to be developing and producing in the public realm our latest framework in this regard, and it will be summarized in the new white paper shortly. Let me just talk about political settlements in the following ways. The definition that James gave is very much one we find useful, with the proviso that we would think about inclusiveness. Political settlements, incomplete political settlements, we know and we have learned to our cost, are often a foundation for bad development and the lack of longer-term stability and can undermine the capacity to deliver development effectively. So us paying more attention to the basis of elite bargaining and elite understanding, at the same time recognizing the need for inclusion, particularly of historically marginalized groups, is fundamental. And of course there are many insights and lessons we now have on this, not least from Afghanistan, which help us recognize that we need to do more work. And I say we here, I don't mean just DFID. Certainly I mean we in terms of the UK government, but with other like-minded partners, on trying to think in what ways can we help support the creation of durable and accountable state structures founded on inclusive political settlements. We may take that up again more in discussion. A few quick points on some things that Sarah said, if I might. I have a couple of minutes. I couldn't agree more about the need for the right kind of expertise, something I have to think a lot about in my role in terms of getting the right mix of advisors. And the reason I flag it is because as the context of where we work changes quite radically away from the more conventional, stable budget support environment, we need a very different set of skills And I think you're absolutely right. And then we're thinking very hard about how best to cultivate those in our own organisation. And absolutely agree about the need for good political analysis to underpin our operational work. On the service gap, I think that was a very interesting concept and something we're very attuned to in getting the balance right between what's the ongoing responsibility of international NGOs, of UN institutions in delivering short-term humanitarian needs, and that harnessing their skills and expertise in terms of rebuilding incipient state structures, especially at the local level, to take over some of those functions in the medium term. Very quickly then, some highlights that will entice you to look out for the eventual press coverage of our white paper. And I will not try and prejudge our ministers by giving you the real detail of the announceables, nor indeed tell you exactly when it's going to be coming out, but it will be out very shortly. At the heart of the four big themes in the white paper that are in our public consultation document around promoting sustainable economic growth in the context of a downturn, much more emphasis on climate change adaptation and mitigation. You will have seen the Prime Minister's very important speech this week, which is testament to that, and conflict and fragility, and finally, effective multilateral institutions. Very briefly, the highlights around conflict and fragility. I'll put my money on the table here. I think this will be one of the most fundamental ways in which our business may be changed in the future by the emphasis it gets in our new white paper. Much more of our spend in the future, bilaterally especially, but also through multilateral institutions, will be in this large category of what, to use our shorthand, it will be of fragile and post-conflict states. That in itself is a significant shift. The resource envelope is going to get bigger. But it also means that we need to think differently about the way we work. In some places, we may be able to use an adapted form of budget support. We've got some very good experience of doing that in Rwanda at a very early and risky stage. Other contexts like Sierra Leone, where it's been more challenging. But in thinking through something like the basic approach to budget support, we probably need to put much, much more emphasis on two areas of work. First of all is on basic technical capacity to manage accountably large infusions of external finance. And that doesn't mean bringing in well-trained British accountants, but it certainly means thinking creatively about drawing more on the technical expertise in the regions in which we work as a means of helping through those early transitions. And managing large infusions of funds in a highly accountable manner, to put in systems in place to ensure that public expenditure management is handled accountably and responsibly. We're thinking also about a range of other instruments in which the challenge is large, rapid disbursement, in which accountability is there up front. More on that again in discussion. I've already mentioned an emphasis on security and access to justice, and thinking that through more as a basic right for the poor, and you'll see some very important announcements around that in the paper. And finally, thinking about more the growth dynamics in post-conflict and fragile states. And it's something, probably an area where we haven't given sufficient attention to in the past, the challenge of large-scale employment generation through local private sector provision. That doesn't mean just creating short-term jobs and building roads. It might involve some of that. But that has a basic benefit in many different ways. It thinks about the long-term implications in terms of conflict prevention. It also creates essential livelihoods and links to the goal of state legitimacy. That is, after all, a critical developmental intervention at an early stage of state building. Finally, we will be doing more to work through and support efforts to strengthen the UN peace-building architecture. Of course, colleagues at the table will be able to say more about that than I can, and work much more through our UN and World Bank counterparts in ensuring that as they scale up their own work in these areas, that we can share some of our emerging policy experience and emphasize, like us, the need to ensure they have the right people in the right place with the right skills. Thank you.